and it's a pleasure to work with you who have helped lead the anti-NAFTA effort for the last many years and have demanded a sensible trade policy which represents the needs of workers rather than just corporate America. And it's nice to be here with Dennis Kucinich of Ohio, who is also joining that fight in a very strong way. Mr. Banya, I remember some 4 years ago you came to the state of Vermont and you addressed a rally in Montpelier, Vermont, where we had 300 or 400 Vermonters who were out protesting NAFTA. And the sad truth is that much of what you and I said on that day, much of what you and I predicted would happen, has in fact occurred. NAFTA is part of a disastrous trade policy which is resulting in record-breaking trade deficit, which is costing us millions of decent-paying jobs. And I wish very, very much, as important as the national deficit is, that the Congress would pay half as much attention to the trade deficit, which is costing us millions of jobs and which is lowering the wages of workers from one end of this country to the other. The essence of our current disastrous trade policy is not very hard to comprehend. You don't have to have a PhD in economics to understand that it is impossible and wrong for American workers to be competing against very desperate people in Mexico and other parts of the world who, because of the economic conditions in their own country, are forced to work for 50 cents an hour or 70 cents an hour. One of the interesting developments in recent weeks, I don't know, Mr. Banya, you may have seen it, is the front page of Business Week. Their cover story reported that CEOs last year earned 54% more than the preceding year. In other words, the compensation for CEOs in this country of the major corporations went up by 54%, while workers are struggling with 2 or 3% increases in their incomes. Now, these very same people who are now averaging over $5 million a year are precisely the same people who told us how great the NAFTA would be. Well, I suppose that they're right. NAFTA has been very good for them, but it has been a disaster for the average American worker. What we know is not only that hundreds of thousands of decent-paying jobs have disappeared from this country, as corporation after corporation has said, why should I pay an American worker 10, 15, 20 bucks an hour when I can get a desperate person in Mexico to work for 50 cents an hour or $1 an hour? Not only have they done that, but in addition to that, they are moving jobs all over the world. I was interested in this last week to read, if it weren't so sad, it really would be funny, where Nike, which seems to have the inclination to move to that country in the world which is now paying the lowest wages, they've now gravitated to Vietnam. And you may have seen in the paper that in Vietnam there is now a demonstration that they're paying below what they even promised the Vietnamese workers, which I would imagine is 20 cents or so an hour. So what we're seeing is these corporations who used to hire American workers at decent wages are now running to Mexico, to other Latin American countries. They're going to China, they're going to Vietnam, where they're hiring people for abysmally low wages. And that is part of our current trade policy. And I think I speak for the vast majority of the people in this country who say that what we have got to have is a fair trade policy which represents the interest of the vast majority of our people and not just corporate America, rather than a so-called free trade policy which forces American workers to compete against desperate people throughout the entire world. Mr. Speaker, one of the issues that concerns me terribly much is that every day that I turn on the television and I listen to the radio and I read the newspapers, I keep hearing about how great the economy is. And I'm sure the economy must be great for somebody, but it's not great for the vast majority of the people in my own state of Vermont. The fact of the matter is that while the wealthiest people in this country are doing phenomenally well, while CEOs now earn over 200 times what their workers earn, the middle class continues to shrink, and most of the new jobs that are being created are low-wage jobs, many of them part-time, many of them temporary, many of them without benefits.
The gentleman yield on that point.
I sure would.
Because I want to elaborate a little bit about the disparity between those at the top and the average worker in this country. In 1960, the difference between what a CEO earned and the average worker was about 12 to 1. In 1974, that increased to about 35 to 1. And as you have just correctly pointed out, now it's 209 to 1. And the average worker in America today, the 80% of people who, pack a lunch and go to work and make this country work, their wages for the last 20 years have basically been frozen. They're real wages. They're not going anywhere. It's the top 20% that are doing very, very well, and the very top are doing exceedingly well. But they're not moving anywhere. I mean, they're frozen. And if you've been one of these people who have worked all your life at a company, or part of your life at a company, and they decide they're going to Mexico and your job is gone, those people are able to get jobs again, but about at 2/3 of the wages that they had formerly been earning, at 2/3 of the salaries that they were making. And that's what's going on. There's an incredible downward pressure on wages. There was a study done by Cornell University for the Department of Labor, which the Department of Labor, by the way, suppressed, because you'll understand why when I tell you what was in the study. They found that 62% of corporations in America today were using Mexico and other countries that pay low wages as a hedge against raising wages or keeping wages flat in this country. They tell their workers, listen, you want an increase in wages or salary, you're not going to get it. You've got to stay where you are. You've got to take a cut in health benefits or pension benefits or a cut in your wages. Or if you don't, we're going south. We're going to Mexico. 62% of the countries, companies doing that. So I thank my friend for raising that point, because it speaks to the increasing disparity we have in economic reality in this country.
Well, let me just say a few words.
We have in economic reality in this country.
Well, let me just say a few words, and I'm going to yield to my friend, Mr. Kucinich. As you know, Mr. Banya, 20 years ago, the United States led the world in terms of the wages and benefits our workers received. And today, as a result of a number of factors, not least of which is our absurd trade policy, we are now in 13th place as a result in terms of wages and benefits. The fact of the matter is that the average American today is working longer hours for lower wages, and they need that extra time in order to compensate for the decline in their income. Clearly, there is something very wrong when from one end of this country to the other, we are seeing the loss of good-paying manufacturing jobs and the substitution of those jobs in the service industry, which pays people $6 an hour, $7 an hour, and often does not have benefits. So I think that probably the most important issue that this Congress should be debating is to demand in one way or another, and I have some thoughts on it, you and Mr. Kucinich have thoughts on it, in one way or another, we have got to tell corporate America, who have made their money in this country, that they have got to begin reinvesting in Vermont, in Michigan, in Ohio, back into the United States of America, put people to work at decent wages rather than running all over the world to hire desperately poor people at starvation wages. And I would be happy to yield to Mr. Kucinich.
Thank you very much, Representative Sanders. It's a pleasure to join you and David Bonier on this issue, which you've led the country on in examining and exposing the deficiencies in the NAFTA agreement. I come from a district in Cleveland, Ohio, which was really built with the labor of steel workers, auto workers, people in machine shops. It's a blue-collar town in many ways. It was part of that great industrial strength of America that helped sustain this country through 2 world wars and really made America preeminent among industrial powers in the war and in the world. I have seen the changes that have taken place in Cleveland and throughout Ohio since NAFTA, and it's not a pretty sight. The state of Ohio alone has lost many jobs. As a matter of fact, I was able to secure a list of jobs, which I have here, and I'd just like to read some of the cities which have lost specific plants to Mexico since NAFTA. And when I read this list, I'd like you to keep in mind that these aren't cold, sterile statistics. When I speak of Franklin Disposables, which lost 50 jobs to Mexico, Dayton, Rich Products, which lost 146 jobs to Mexico. Green, Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, lost 60 jobs. In each case, the statistics have behind them a story of a family whose breadwinner could no longer produce and sustain a family, have a story of a young person who lost out on an educational opportunity because the money wasn't there to sustain it. There's a story of a family which worked a lifetime to have a home, and suddenly holding on to that home is impossible. A story of medical bills that can't be met. A story of a dream that's shattered, a dream that's deferred, a dream that's denied. And we in the Congress have a responsibility to come forward with information and to show that in Greenville, Ohio, for example, 180 people were laid off from Allied Signal. Those people made air filters, oil filters, and spark plugs. And do you know, that's one snapshot because we have a $39 billion trade deficit because of NAFTA, and much of it, 3/4 of it, is in the automotive-related sector. So multiply one family, one dream, times thousands and thousands across this country, and you have a sea change occurring in this country, and the American dream is changing. This country was built with steel, automotive, aerospace, basic industries, provided the muscle for America, gave us might, helped to preserve this country and protect our democratic values. And any change which undermines those industries undermines, I contend, our basic democratic principles and traditions, because if we don't have the ability to produce steel, if we don't have the ability to have a strong automotive industry, if we cannot be strong and secure in our aerospace, we undermine our national security. But of course, the greatest security we have, as we all know, is a job. And NAFTA has cost this country thousands upon thousands of jobs. As a matter of fact, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act, as you probably know, Mr. Bonier, because we were talking about this last week, the last count was 118,000 jobs.
And that's a conservative estimate. If you use the formula that the proponents of NAFTA gave us in terms of creation of jobs, if you use that very formula, we have lost about 600,000 jobs as a result of NAFTA. So, and of course, we know many, many people just don't apply for trade adjustment assistance.
Well, you're right, and the Economic Policy Institute estimates that, in fact, 420,000 U.S. jobs were either lost or never created because they were created in another country due to NAFTA. Now, the next question is, what kind of jobs are being created? We know we're losing manufacturing jobs, which are good-paying jobs, which have enabled people to have a decent life, live in nice neighborhoods,
sure,
the kind of neighborhoods that we dream about.
Buy a home, send your kid to college, take a nice vacation, be able to retire with dignity, with good health care. Well,
and you need to be making a good wage to do that. But what's happening is that this transition in our economy, while it's wiping out good-paying manufacturing jobs, it's creating jobs, according to the Department of Labor, among the top 20 occupations having the largest numerical increase in the next decade in the U.S. Cashiers. Now, cashiers are very important jobs. Janitors, retail sales clerks, waiters and waitresses. Those are all important jobs, and those are our constituents. But in order to sustain those jobs, in order to sustain this economy, we have to do it with manufacturing, and we have to keep creating new industries, and we're not doing that.
Yeah. I yield to my friend from New York to respond to my friend from Ohio.
I thank the gentleman for holding this special order with respect to NAFTA. And as the chairman of the subcommittee on the workforce of the Education and the Workforce Committee, I want to go beyond what's been said here so far and say that what we have in motion here is that NAFTA has become given an incentive to the corporate powers to wipe out the American workforce as we know it. American labor shall not exist in 10 years as we know it if they are able to continue as they are moving. The incentive to make more and more profits on the backs of cheap labor has led to a situation where it's been concluded by corporate power that they have to wipe out the American labor movement. Working conditions and environmental conditions are just as important as wages in these considerations with respect to cheap labor costs. And they want a situation where they're in position to dictate not only the low wages, but also the working conditions, and to be free of any environmental regulations. As a chairman of the workforce subcommittee, what I've noticed is that all of the talk in this particular session of Congress about bipartisan cooperation and civility does not apply to anything related to organized labor. We have seen an assault start in this Congress on labor, unprecedented. Several hearings have been held on the right of labor unions to use their money for political education. And they've gone after them where it hurts a great deal in terms of how they can spend their own funds, and they're challenging their ability to make decisions as a majority, that if any one member of any union objects to his money being used some way, his money should be segregated from the rest, and the majority rule as to how funds are spent can't apply. That's one way to cripple unions. Another way is, of course, to come after the Fair Labor Standards Act. And a lot of people think that the comp time bill is related to families and giving people an opportunity to have time off, but the comp time bill is all about the Fair Labor Standards Act as a major weapon of labor. And if you get at the heart and soul of the Fair Labor Standards Act, you help to cripple unions. The OSHA continues to be under attack. We just had a hearing on methylene chloride, a substance which causes cancer, causes pneumonia. It's clearly, every study has shown it to be more dangerous than they previously understood it to be, and it's being resisted. The regulations promulgated by OSHA after 10 years being resisted, and they're using the threat that we'll take the use of methylene chloride, all the business that needs it, we'll take it overseas. Airplanes, for example, have to use it in order to take the paint off when they check the body of airplanes to see if they're still sound, and that's probably the largest use of methylene chloride. It's a huge business. They're threatening to take them to places overseas if we have the regulation installed by OSHA, just as they are threatening, of course, on any other environmental condition we set which safeguards the health of workers. So we have an attempt by corporate power to create a new class of workers, something between serfs and peasants, in order to maximize their profits. They'll come back and they'll bring the jobs back once they do that. But NAFTA, GATT allows them to make huge profits and use the cheapest labor in the world to make those profits, and acquire the power necessary to destroy the labor force and the organized labor in this country. Yes.
It's a good point you make, and I'll yield to Mr. Sanders to answer it, and then I want to come in because it's a
Let me just pick up on Mr. Owen's point, and that is essentially, if you have desperate people in Mexico who are making 50 cents an hour, who are living in shacks, whose kids may be begging out on the street, who are forced to work under the most horrendous conditions imaginable. What corporate America is saying, hey, if we can get people at those conditions over there, we can drive wages and working conditions down here. Because what we say to the American worker is, hey, if you don't like what you're getting today, we're going to go over there. I just got a letter today from a corporate entity in the state of Vermont who told us about how high the wages are in Vermont. He could go elsewhere, and so forth and so on. So I think it is not only a labor issue, it is an environmental issue, it is a union issue. And that is what our entire trade policy is about. It is the race to the bottom. It is saying to American workers, there are people in China, Mexico, throughout the world who are prepared to work for almost nothing. And we're going to lower your wages and lower your working conditions, lower the environmental standards that you work under, lower and lower and lower. Not raise the other people, but lower ours until we have an equalized workforce around the world. A very, very dangerous trend, which, as you indicated, is wiping out the middle class and creating pathetically low-wage jobs.
And you know, before there was a middle class in this country, or a strong middle class, a large middle class like we have today, people struggled the same way. They didn't make good wages here. They didn't have any benefits. But they got together and they believed that they had certain inalienable rights, and among them were the right to organize the right to assemble, the right to collective bargaining, and the right to strike. And that's how the movement got started, because of the abuse, the labor movement, of workers in this country. And it was only through the labor movement that we built this expansive middle class in this country. I mean, if I saw something the other day, I was driving to work and I saw a banner over a bridge that said, let me recall the exact words, the labor movement, the people who brought you the weekend. And I thought to myself, you know, that's a really a creative. There could have been a lot of things up there. The people that brought you a livable wage, the people that brought you health and safety protection, that brought you health care, that brought you Social Security, that brought you Medicare, that brought you compensation if you got laid off. I mean, all these things could have been up there on that banner. Yeah. And you're absolutely right, Mr. Owens.
They brought you the weekend
going
on the
on
Fair Labor Standards Act.
That's right.
That's how the weekend came.
And what's going on is they're trying to break labor in this country today, the corporations. And they're doing it through a variety of different ways. There are hundreds of law firms in this country that specialize in nothing else but busting unions in America. That's how they make their living. And I just came back from a very interesting discussion. I came from the Methodist building across the street, and I was listening to a group of people talk about the Kmart strike that occurred in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1993. A lot of workers wanted to form a union in Greensboro, North Carolina, and they were prevented from forming a union. And they got together and they signed cards, and the majority of them wanted a union, and the union wouldn't negotiate a contract. And they got the whole community involved that this was the right thing to do. It was the moral thing to do. People wanted to be represented, and they needed to be represented, but the corporation, the multinational corporation, which, by the way, is located very close to my district, about 2 or 3 miles outside my district, they wouldn't recognize them. So what happened, and what's got to happen today in America and in Mexico and in other places, is that you've got to get the community involved to get people organized again so they can stand up for those basic inalienable rights of being able to assemble, to collective bargaining, and the right to earn their own bread. And they did that down in Greensboro. They got the churches together. They got the progressive people in the business community, and they said, this is wrong. These people decided they wanted to come together for a decent wage and decent working conditions, and they ought to be recognized. And through a 3-year struggle, they finally did it. But even more importantly, they formed a sense of community out of that process, and that is now being used to work on education issues and a whole variety of other issues. Now, we've gotten off the track a little bit here.
I think it's very much on track. That process is being endangered now. If you wipe out the ability to organize and you wipe out unions who have the resources and the know-how to organize, then you're going to shut off that whole process. There's an article in the February issue of Atlantic Monthly by a very successful capitalist named George Soros. Well, he's saying capitalism is out of control, and capitalism is going to destroy itself because there's so much power and such a great abuse of power until it's going to end what he calls the open society, what I call the society of checks and balances. Institutions like organized labor become a check on the power of corporations.
You're absolutely right.
Corporations are running rampant over everybody, so the process of being able to organize is going to be wiped out.
Well, there is no countervailing force today.
Right.
Like there used to be unions, and government used to provide a balancing against runaway greed.
Let me pick up on that point if I could,
ahead.
Mr. Biden. Sorry to interrupt you, but just let's examine that point for a second. In terms of distribution of wealth in America, you have the richest 1% now owning 42% of the wealth, which is more than the bottom 90%. Now, one of the problems that all of us have is in dealing with the media. In terms of getting information out to people, one of the reasons that half the people in America no longer bother to vote is they're not getting information that is relevant to their lives. Who owns the media? When we talk about NAFTA, I remember this very, very clearly. It was quite unbelievable. Poll after poll showed that the country was pretty evenly divided. Some were for NAFTA, some were anti-NAFTA. We went through every single major newspaper in the United States of America, every single one of them. Were they evenly divided? Were they 2-to-1 pro-NAFTA? Every single one of them was pro-NAFTA, as was virtually every corporation in America. So you see who owns the media. We're seeing in terms of contributions to both political parties. Not an accident that you have this trade policy. This is a trade policy that works well for corporate America. It hurts the working people. Well, where does the money come to fund the parties? It comes from the wealthy people. And we see the results of that in terms of our trade policy in almost every aspect of our life. We're seeing a greater and greater concentration of wealth and power. And in many ways, I must say, that this country is beginning to look more like an oligarchy than it is like a democracy.
Every new NAFTA, every new GATT adds to that corporate power. It allows them to make higher and higher profits, 59% since 1993. That's light stuff compared to what is going on now, I'm sure, in terms of the stock market still booming. And they get more and more wealth to use to oppress the people who are the overwhelming majority in America, but don't have a voice. Like you said, they own the media, they snuff out the open society, they snuff out the checks and balances, and they're going to snuff out the consumer market that is the driving engine for capitalism. As Soros puts it, they're going to destroy themselves if there's no check and balance on them.
And when you have people like Soros and the Goldsmith fellow from Europe, or, you know, these are very wealthy and prosperous and well-known capitalists in the world starting to speak out like maybe we're going too far here. When you have that kind of voice starting to be heard, well, then you know something is really out of whack. When the people at the very top start to say, wait a minute, maybe we're piling up too much greed here by getting 294% profit increases since 1993. What also, I want to make one other quick point here, and that is with respect to labor unions, and then I'll yield to my friend from Ohio. When labor unions were at their peak in this country, you know, when 35% of the American people belonged in the workforce, belonged to a labor union, they would produce 90%. I'll give you the figure. In the late 1950s, they were producing 90% in productivity. They were getting about 99% back in wages. Well, in about 1974, they were getting about half of what they were getting in wages and what they were producing. And then in the 1980s, it was about a third of what they were getting back in terms of wages from what they were producing in productivity. So as labor's numbers started to decline in terms of representing people in this country from 35% in the 1950s down to the present, I think, 14–15%, the workers' take in terms of what they took home was less and less of what they produced in terms of proportion. And that's one of the tragedies of this equation that's now allowed the corporate folks in America to move with impunity down to places like Mexico and exploit workers down there at 70 cents an hour. I yield to my friend from Ohio.
You know, Mr. Bonnier, when you think about the history of the growth, the economic growth in this country, which permitted the rise of the middle class, which permitted people to go from $10 to $15 to even $20 an hour. I mean, it's really somewhat of a miracle that America sustained this, and then comes trade agreements like NAFTA, and people start to see those jobs slip away. And the question arises, well, why would someone pay $20 an hour, let's say, as opposed to 91 cents an hour, as some workers in Mexico are making for basically doing the same work that someone who had a job that paid $20 an hour did prior to that job leaving. And the reason why you pay that amount is in order to maintain a democracy, you have to make sure people have a lot of choices, and they have to have a good income, and that income gives them the ability to be free economically. Because let's face it, if you don't have economic freedom, your political freedom is compromised.
And consumer spending is still 2/3 of our economy. Consumer spending. We're going to wipe out the consumer spending.
Mr. Owens is correct.
There's a piece written by Stanley Scheinbaum, who's a friend of mine, lives in California. It was entitled in his quarterly that he publishes, "Who's going to buy the goods?" And he kind of lays it all out. If we keep driving wages down, this downward pressure on wages, at some point in this process, we're not going to have, and our families are not going to have the wherewithal to make the purchases that make the engine of this country run.
Well, in 1997, in January, the Economic Development Corporation of Tijuana was advertising that they would pay wages and benefits together of 91 cents an hour in the Maquiadora areas. Now, those are the kinds of jobs that are moving to Mexico from areas like Ohio, manufacturing jobs. The problem is, though, if you're making 91 cents an hour, You're not buying a new home that costs $60,000, $70,000. You're not buying a new car that costs $18,000 to $20,000. You're not purchasing an education for your child if you're making 91 cents an hour. The wage level promotes economic activity in this country that sustains the type of society we have. Now, if we were to turn it on its head and say, well, what happens if you make 50 cents in some cases or 91 cents an hour? You cannot aspire to those kinds of things which we in this country have come to expect as what we call the American way of life. And the great thing about this country is that we think we can reach even higher, that once we reach a certain niche, we're going to reach a little bit higher. We get there, we reach a little bit higher. Well, now we're finding we can't do that because the jobs are starting to go away and out of this country. Now, you raised the issue earlier, Mr. Bonner, Mr. Owens, and Mr. Sanders all raised the issue of the attack that's going on working people due to NAFTA. You know, how people are being threatened that, look, if you start organizing, we're going to move your jobs. Your jobs are gone. And I got a hold of a Cornell University report, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
That's the one I referred to, the Labor Department, Cornell did for the Labor Department. They suppressed it, by the way. The Labor Department wouldn't let it out, and we finally came out.
Well,
Which Labor Department?
As the
U.S. Labor Department.
I know you've seen it because this is close to your district. And as I read it, I was shocked when I saw that the kinds of tactics that were used. Would it please the gentleman? Could I
sure,
read this
please.
into the record? This is a very interesting report from Cornell. Here's the kind of things that they found out. In our follow-up with interviews with organizers in campaigns where plant closing threats occurred, we learned that specific unambiguous threats ranged from attaching shipping labels to equipment throughout the plant with a Mexican address, to posting maps of North America with an arrow pointing from the current plant site to Mexico, to a letter stating the company will have to shut down if the union wins the election. I mean, this is just part of the kinds of things that were put. They gave the example, you remember, Mr. Bonner, the ITT automotive plant in Michigan, where the company parked 13 flatbed tractor trailers loaded with shrink-wrapped production equipment in front of the plant for a duration of an organizing campaign, had a hot pink sign on it which read Mexico transfer job. Now, think about that. That's just one example. How can people then try to aspire to a higher wage? How can people hope for better benefits? How can they get their health benefits improved? How can they hope that they'll have more time to spend with their families? They can't, because they're held captive by this. And that's one of the reasons why I appreciate Mr. Bonner, Mr. Sanders, and Mr. Owen having an opportunity to participate in this debate with you and in this discussion of the importance of this issue to the American people, because it has real effects. I mean, I started off this discussion. I have, there's a list of dozens of cities that are losing the lifeblood of the community because of this trade agreement.
Well, I think may I just jump in for a second?
Please do.
Is picking up on Mr. Kucinich's point, and that is the truth of the matter is the average American worker is scared to death.
Very scared.
People are scared to death precisely because of what Mr. Kucinich was saying, because if they stand up for their rights, their company is going to say, we don't need you anymore, we're going to Mexico and we're going to China. Now, ultimately, I think after all of this discussion, after all of what is said and done, it seems to me our challenge is a very simple one. It is to tell corporate America that they no longer have the right to run all over the world and throw American workers out on the street and then be able to bring their products back into this country duty-free. Hey, you don't have to be a genius to know that you make a lot more money paying a Mexican kid or a Chinese young lady 20 or 30 cents an hour than paying an American worker a living wage. You don't have to be a genius. And the problem is we have allowed them to do that. We have allowed them to run all over the world. And the end result is what Mr. Bonner's chart tells us: corporate profits are soaring. The end result is what Business Week told us 2 weeks ago, that the top CEOs in this country saw an increase in their compensation last year of 54%, and they now earn 209 times what the average American worker earns. I hadn't realized that one person is worth 209 times more than another person, that their children are worth 209 times more than the children of a worker. It is obscene. It is wrong.
You know, Mr. Sanders, it's possible that many Americans for years and years have understood and even accepted those kinds of disparities as long as they had jobs. I mean, you know, we all expect that the bosses and the people that head the corporations are going to make more money. We all know that. But what's happening now, though, is that the salaries are going up for the officers, and I'm all for people making good salary, but the workers are losing their jobs.
They're losing their jobs, and they're finding other jobs that pay considerably less. And what happens when that occurs? That starts a cycle. Well, you work overtime, or you work 2 jobs, or you work 3 jobs, and that cycle produces a situation where you're not home at night to see your son or your daughter's soccer game, or you're not there for the PTA meeting. And then all those other social maladies that we all talk about and we all wrestle with and we all struggle with around here occur. And it's a vicious cycle, and it starts with wages often.
And it gets back, and it goes to family values and democratic values, which underpin our ability to celebrate family values.
And if Congressman Sanders was implying before that the challenge to us is to stop them from making products in other countries with the cheapest possible labor, and then bringing them back here to sell them duty-free, well, that option is gone already. NAFTA is like the international law. GATT is international law. You can't stop them anymore from bringing those products back. We'll be violating the treaties that we've already agreed to.
That's why we have to repeal those pieces of legislation.
That's the task before us, to repeal those pieces of legislation. Also, to do everything possible to get laws in place which won't allow them to keep beating down the workforce, wipe out organized labor. There are a lot of things we can do right now to stop this, and our own tax laws allow the CEOs of American corporations to earn these obscene salaries. By the way, they earn the highest salaries in the world. Japanese CEOs, German CEOs, other CEOs across the world are not earning those kinds of salaries. We have the greediest. And if we had some tax laws which dealt with the people who are making the profits, instead of the present situation where individuals and families are paying 44% of the income tax in this country, while corporations are paying a little more than 11%. There are a lot of things we can do to help to begin to bring some sense back into American capitalism. It was a capitalism that worked before. It worked. Henry Ford recognized it when he said, I really need these people to make more money to buy my cars.
So he paid them $5
basic,
an hour. And they
basic principle that ought to be the bedrock of American capitalism, and what they're doing is throwing it away because we're not producing workers who can buy the products anymore.
I remember a time when a label that said "Made in America" was something that you couldn't help but see, no matter where you went. And now it's difficult to shop for goods, and when you check for a label, to find things that are made in this country. And again, if they're made in America, somebody's made them, they had a job, they were supporting a family. I just want to stay on that because, to me, the essence of supporting the democratic tradition in America is to make sure that people have jobs. And I think in a democratic society, I take issue with our friends over at the Fed. I don't think there's any such thing as a certain amount of unemployment necessary to the functioning of the economy. The fact of the matter is that in a democratic society, if you want to maintain that democracy, you have to make sure people have a chance to participate through their jobs and with a decent wage level. And that's what NAFTA has affected. There's a myth about, people talk about the benefits of NAFTA. You've heard people say that exports to Mexico have increased. That is true, but what they don't tell you is that the imports have increased at a higher rate, so therefore the trade deficit grows and the job loss continues. You hear people say that the Mexican workers have a better life. Well, that's not necessarily true, because what's happened, and this is going to surprise many people, people out there think, well, it's the Mexican workers who are suddenly benefiting. Not necessarily true. In 1994, before the peso collapsed, real hourly wages were 30% lower than in 1980 in Mexico. And after the peso fell, the wages fell another 25%. Mr. Bonnier, I know that you've tracked this, because listen to this. The earnings in the maquiladora sector are only 60% of the former manufacturing sector. So the Mexican workers are being attacked as well.
I was down in Mexico in Tijuana on the border, in the maquiladora area about 6 weeks ago. And I had the chance to talk with workers, visit their villages and their colonia. And they work at very modern facilities. This Hyundai company from Korea and Samsung from Korea and Panasonic, and these are new plants, efficient. These workers are good workers, they work hard, but they get paid $5 a day, $5 a day. I mean, and they live in just very terrible conditions. I mean, their housing is not good. They live, as I said earlier, in situations where the water that they bathe in and drink is contaminated. The American Medical Association called it a cesspool of infectious disease. I mean, and these corporations do nothing about establishing any type of a tax base to improve the environment, to improve wages or health conditions. I talked to one leader of a colonia, where that's a village, where most of the people worked at this factory, and he told me that a lot of his friends and relatives in this village were losing fingers and hands because the line was going so fast. I mean, enough to alarm people. It wasn't just one or two. So since there was no really any union representation, they decided to shut the place down for a couple of hours one day to protest. So of course he was fired as the leader. He eventually ended up in jail when he tried to form an independent union. Now that's what these people are up against. They have no, they can't buck an indifferent government and a corporate mentality that just doesn't want to deal with this at all. And that's the hedge, that's the wedge, I should say, in which our workers are competing against. It's this drive to the lowest standard, as Mr. Saunders has said. And what we need to do is raise their standard up to our level.
And that's something that certainly Fast Track must be challenged to do, but it doesn't do that because it doesn't provide for the kinds of worker and environmental protections which we need to see established so that we don't find our standards under attack in this country.
These trade agreements have all kinds of wonderful protection for property, intellectual property, CDs, all this type of stuff. We've got an agreement with Mexico where you can go to jail if you do that or you pirate this stuff. And, if it comes to property, there's sanctions and they're tough, but when it comes to people, when it comes to the environment, there's nothing on the books to protect them.
See, the importance of us taking a stand on this cannot be repeated enough, because what I remember when I was first starting my career back in the city of Cleveland, and as all politicians, you go through a crowd and you shake hands. And I remember some of the older men in particular who worked in the assembly lines, you'd shake hands, but occasionally you'd see someone come up, they'd be missing fingers, or part of their hand was gone, or part of an arm was gone, or maybe they lost sight of an eye because a piece of steel went into it or something at work. We realized in this country over a period of decades that it was important to maintain certain safe working conditions. And you know what? America helped set world standards for that. We were the ones, because of the standards that we set, which gave workers everywhere a chance to be a little bit better protected on the job, and therefore also helped industry become more efficient because they weren't losing the services of workers who were performing needed work and didn't want to interrupt it through injury. So through a whole series of laws, occupational safety acts, and through acts that dealt with safety in a workplace, in environmental laws, we were able to guarantee that workers would have a little bit of protection on the job. Now, what happens if we do not keep that standard up there, and that standard starts to slip? Then we're back to the days where people aren't safe in the workplace.
Well, if I can
it is
interrupt,
already slipping.
Just a moment. It's not a question if, it's a question that it is happening.
It is slipping already.
I mean, let's not be naive about this. What is going on now is the standard of living of the average American worker is in serious decline. Gap between the rich and the poor is growing wider. The control of the political parties is growing sharper by the very wealthy. Ultimately, I think as a nation, we have got to ask ourselves, how much is enough? When does it end? How much do they want? 209 times more than their workers? 500 times more than their workers? Are we going to hear a movement here to bring back slavery? I mean, when does it end? We have people in this country, in my state now, they're not working one job, they're working 2 jobs, they're working 3 jobs. As you said, Mr. Banya, these are people who, I've met a husband and wife, they hardly ever see each other. They're both working 3 part-time jobs. When does it end? This is a wealthy country. This is a great country. But we need policy so that we redevelop our manufacturing sector, we create decent paying jobs in this country. With all of the new technology, you know what? The working hour should go down, shouldn't it? With all of these new machines, people should be producing more,
Be working less.
working less. And yet what's happening? Just the opposite is happening. And what's the end result? The end result is corporate profits soar, CEOs' salaries soar, distribution of wealth becomes more and more unfair.
We
And
had a capitalism that worked for both the